All right, so that's going. I'm going to go ahead and open chat, see if people start coming in. Cool. Looks like all the chats are connecting. All right. So if you're joining us, we'll start soon. As you can probably see the placeholder. Just let us know that you're in chat, and we'll get rolling. I'm going to get this open over here. Cool. Says I've got a viewer. What's up, Blair? How are you, man? We're going to get rolling in just a second. Just making sure we've got Billy all set up. Yeah, it's Liam time. Liam and Billy time. Like it's going to be fun. Sure, I got these notifications. Cool. Went live. Cool. All right. So I'm going to give it about 3 minutes. I know that we don't have anything cool on the screen at the moment. It's just this placeholder. It's mostly just to kind of build suspense. But thanks for joining in and joining the chat. I see George Wallace, Serge, got Blair. So quite a few people joining already. Pause that. I'm going to share this. All right. Billy, is the chat working for you? Have you checked that out? Did it actually? Yeah. Okay. Hopefully that will. Okay. We'll keep trying. If not, we might have to do your backup plan with the chat. Kwong, all right, what's up? How you doing, man? All right, so I know I'm a few minutes early, but tonight we're doing something a little bit different. It's myself and Billy Chitkin, and we're going to talk about his work. I'm going to show his reel in just a second, and we're going to kind of dive into his workflow a little bit. So when I go ahead and switch over to this here and rewind it a little bit, and we'll get going. And ready. Yeah. All right, so that's Billy's awesome reel, and I'm gonna go ahead and close this out and his website, and we'll go back in. So there's Billy. Billy, you're now on screen. Say hi to everybody, and let's see if I can get chat back up here. I guess chat's not loading on OBS today. That's fun. Why are you gone, chat? Cool. All right, whatever. That's fine. So if you're trying to read chat along, guys, it's being finicky. This is the first time we're doing this cool little group live stream thing, an interview. so bear with us. But all right, so Billy, why don't we do this? Tell us a little bit about your background, how you got started. I'd known you from School of Motion and interacting with you at Half Res and things like that. But for those who don't know you, how'd you get started, and what are you doing these days? Oh, hold on 1 second, Billy. Blair says audio's not coming through on YouTube. Sorry. Yeah. Blair, are you able to hear me and just not Billy? Because maybe I just need to change the settings there. For me, but not Billy. Oh no. I feel like that happened the other day too when I was trying to do stuff. Let's see. Yes, not okay. Advanced audio properties. Put that over onto this track too. See if that helps. All right, so we will try this again. Hey, Billy, why don't you try talking, and then Blair, since
All right.
you're proactive.
Let's see if you can hear me now, Blair. Hopefully it's all good.
Because I can see your audio going up on OBS.
Yep, I've got levels in my mixer. Obviously you can hear me.
Yeah.
Hey,
all
Blair
good.
says all good. Cool.
Cool. All right. I think it's because YouTube goes down to mono, and I had you on a second track, so
okay.
I had to join those up. All right.
All right. So,
sorry.
The
background.
The short version of the short version is I would make videos with my friends. Started learning an NLE kind of on my own. Sony Vegas was like my first video editing program. I was also at the right age, a year or two into college, and decided to jump over to the media program as opposed to like hard science stuff, which is what I was doing. One thing leads to another. I started learning After Effects, and then I started learning Maya at the school, and then I get one semester into Maya. This is, I think, 6 years ago now, and Grayscale Gorilla was just starting to come up. Somebody had posted a GIF of one of Nick's tutorials on the Maya subreddit and said, "Hey, how do we make this in Maya?" And somebody in the comments was like, "Oh, just download Cinema. It would be way easier to do." And so I gave that a shot. Kind of started learning about it over the summer, fell in love with it, and then pretty much I would go to school, learn Maya, and then go home and teach myself the equivalent function in Cinema. So if we learned rigging, I would learn rigging. If we were doing dynamics, I would learn dynamics. Yada, yada, yada. A couple years later, I've got some solid student work from the After Effects courses that I took and the Cinema stuff that I would do on my own time. Fortunate to land a handful of like just quick little internships as soon as I was getting out of school. And then, I don't know, like 4 years later, here we are.
Cool.
I just kind of keep plugging away at it every day. Even if I don't post, I'm most likely doing something in Cinema or Photoshop or After Effects, whatever. So I guess the learning never stops.
Now, so yeah, like the way you're explaining that about going from like Maya to Cinema and learning at the same time, that really sounds like Tokyo Megaplex, who you know from Brograph. That I think he's pretty much doing the same thing right now. So that's really interesting that people are kind of doing the hard stuff and then going home and kind of reapplying it to Cinema. Now, two, you said like about 4 years. Now you just went freelance as well,
Hmm.
right? And so during that whole 4 years, were you working, or how long would you say that you would call yourself a professional where you decided to make the leap into freelance?
Yeah, so I think if I check my degrees, they would be dated December of 2013. So by the spring of 2014 is when I had a pretty decent body of work as a student, um, where I was able to land an internship or two. And then I got my first real job in the summer of 2014. Although for the first few months I was technically an intern, I was working on full production stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't like a coffee runner or anything, unfortunate like that. I was, getting in there, working on edits, working on 3D stuff, like pretty heavy stuff, kind of right off the bat in cinema, and just really haven't stopped since then. Like you said, I went freelance 4 months ago,
Mm-hmm.
and so far it's paid off. I've networked locally and online, and I've gotten my name out there as much as I can, and at least locally, anyone that I think should know me knows me,
Mm-hmm.
um, which is an important thing. I know not everyone is in a region that they have a local scene or whatever, but if you are in a sizable market, definitely did not neglect getting out there and shaking people's hands and getting face to face with people, because so far that's how I've gotten all of my work as a freelancer.
Yeah, I totally relate to that. And like Blair, who's in the chat right now, and he's got the Pro Video podcast. I was saying that on his podcast that I noticed a huge difference between just networking online and then last year where I started to actually go out to like half res and things like that. That getting a physical face out there really makes a big difference for some reason. That just it really builds a whole nother level of trust. Um, so with all that, so you've worked in Maya and cinema. I'm guessing you've kind of taken the route that most people have taken when coming from like standard and physical, and then
Hmm.
started to dive into third parties. So why don't you talk about that a little bit? I know from talking with you and knowing you for a while now that you, like me, kind of started in like an Octane path and then have started to merge into Redshift and maybe other explorations that I don't know about.
Yeah, yeah. Towards the tail end of my time at school, I was learning V-Ray. I
Okay.
was fortunate to have a extremely knowledgeable, probably the smartest single human I know, teach me, or teach the class for V-Ray. And then the last month or so, we also started kind of playing with a pretty early build of Arnold. And
Mm-hmm.
this is years ago, like before Autodesk acquired it. Um, it was like mega alpha, but that was really cool. And I think that's where I caught the rendering bug, or like the look dev bug. Um, Rendering, on like meager student wage level hardware was always the most frustrating thing. I remember the first big thing I did was one of the 5 second projects that GSG used to put on,
Mm-hmm.
and I think I rendered it for like 5 days straight on my laptop, just letting my laptop do absolutely nothing other than render for over 100 hours or whatever. And
Yeah.
I just kind of thought that that was ridiculous. And um, 2014 2015-ish is when people really kind of started uh, coming up in popularity. He'd been doing cinema stuff for a year or two at that point, but I think 2014 was really when he started you know blowing up. And pretty soon some other people in my local scene uh, got into Octane. Um, I followed shortly thereafter with just like one video card in my computer, and every couple months or so, I would just buy another video card, and uh, just to make Octane faster and faster every time.
Mm-hmm.
And that pretty much carried me into the beginning of last year. I was working on a pretty cool like sci-fi spaceship scene in Octane, and like the poly counts were just pushing the 6 gig video cards that I have. Just they're getting pushed way too hard. And then I started transitioning into like rendering cars for fun, which we'll be covering pretty shortly, probably
Okay.
in my little demo. And the worst thing about Octane, in my opinion, was, I mean, it's a cool engine. It's super fast. Texturing in it's pretty straightforward. The nodes, are easy to use, yada yada. But working in the live viewer and then submitting to the picture viewer at the end, um, because of the way that Cinema handles the level of detail
Mm-hmm.
setting, I would get files that would just crash constantly when I would submit them to the picture viewer, and then I would have to spend a few hours or even a few days if it was a big project, squashing bugs and getting the VRAM limit down like small enough to where I could submit to the picture viewer. And I just kind of got tired of that after a certain amount of time, and started looking for other options. Again, like I'm committed to GPU hardware.
Mm-hmm.
And so once Redshift started kind of becoming popular last spring, it started looking more and more appealing to me. And by the time I was done with that spaceship scene, I'd had it with Octane. Um, and yeah, I jumped on Redshift kind of as quick as I could. And I haven't looked back since June. So,
Nice. Yeah, I totally relate. Like I was using Octane for about 18 months, and then I had a big project, a VR project, and it just couldn't keep up, and I couldn't go to a render farm, and I couldn't buy more GPUs. Like I was just maxed out. So at that point, I was at just my wits end. So I started looking to Arnold because at least that way it might be a little bit slow on the local end doing look dev, but I could send it out and never really max out my scene. Um,
mhm.
and then yeah, I'd say probably I think it was like June or July last year. I just dove in, and it's been great ever since. Um, so you've kind of answered my next question. I was going to ask you what draws you to Redshift, but it seems like part of it you've already answered is that you have gotten to a point where you've outgrown Octane because of
Mhm.
VRAM limits. But is there anything else that kind of keeps you with it, or um, do you feel like you're still jumping around between Octane and Redshift, or are you still looking at the future for other engines too?
Mm, I don't know, like I was telling you a little bit before stream started. I still have crashes with Redshift.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not perfect, and I question any GPU engine being 100% as stable as, say, Arnold is on CPU. And
Mm-hmm.
that's simply because when you get into video card rendering, you now have another entire level of the operating system to basically fight through. The cool thing with CPU engines is all of the scene memory or whatever is stored in your RAM, which is the most immediate connection to the CPU in terms of your hardware.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing in between the CPU and the RAM to communicate with. The difference with the video card stuff is you have the OpenGL or DirectX, basically, language as a barrier, and that is just always going to prove problems because now you're introducing the video card driver as the translator basically between the CPU and the GPU. And until we get video cards with an unlimited amount of VRAM, you're always going to have to manage like scene size or like memory size or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I know Redshift can alleviate that a little bit with the out of core memory, but yeah, I mean, if I guess if Arnold goes GPU and it's as stable as it is on CPU, I'll probably wind up there.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I'm
Yeah.
I'm not married to any one engine. It's just I no longer use Octane, simply because when I throw like the cars that I throw at it,
Mm-hmm.
it just doesn't jive on my system. So
Yeah.
I'm using Redshift in the meantime, I guess until there's something better.
Yeah. Yeah. I hear you with that. Like I really like the cleanliness of Arnold, like that look. But like you're
Hmm.
saying, like there's something about speed and just being able to look dev quickly. Um, but I don't know. I still hop around. Like I'm kind of like you. I don't really want to just I do all these Redshift tutorials, but like if a client comes in, I still work on Octane stuff if I need to, or Arnold stuff if I need to. So I think it's really good that you're doing that as well, where you're kind of still keeping your options open, but it sounds like you're just going with GPU and whatever's working best for you. So why don't we do that now? Like you said that you've been doing a lot of car work lately, and I know that you've got some scenes that you wanted to show and talk about. So we can go ahead and dive into some of those and talk about them.
Yeah, so we'll jump into the first one, which was the cover banner, or whatever you want to call it. So let me get the screen share going.
Sure. Arnold is unbiased, Sean. That's it's like a CPU version of Octane in that way, but you can do a lot of cheating with it still, just because of like all the AOVs and nodes and that good stuff. All right, so
and I kind of don't like the sort of fanboy, Xbox versus PlayStation aspect of like picking render engines. Um, I kind of hate anytime I see somebody ask like what something was rendered in, because it really doesn't matter. Like, I mean, it really doesn't. Like, all at this point, all of these engines are almost capable of the same look.
right.
It's just a matter of like preference or stability, whatever sort of hardware you have, etc. Um, so yeah, like, I mean, I own Cycles, I own Octane, I own Redshift. I would use any of those at any point in time, depending on the job, depending on the look, provided it's not hindering me from completing that. So
Yeah.
I guess let's just jump into this
Sure.
first scene. So we'll fire up the render view. And I guess just real quick, I'll kind of go over my workflow. Just as a side note, and we crashed. Hey,
Oh.
hey, look at that. Good
so
old computers.
so yeah, you're on R16. That's crazy to me.
Yeah. The story about that is I haven't been freelancing long enough to justify buying a new copy.
Yeah.
I have this license. I actually received it as exchange payment from my first internship. They had two seats of cinema and only one artist. I interned there being the second artist, and then the place kind of folded.
Hmm.
And that's how I sort of ended the internship.
Yeah.
And I guess part of them folding as a business was they didn't have the kind of right revenue stream or whatever, and so I offered to exchange the last month of payment for um, the license of cinema, because I mean I guess they could have resold it, but whatever, I threw
Yeah.
that out as an option to them, and they were like, okay, we'll take this instead of paying you. And that was years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Cool.
I always like to make jokes of I'm in the dark ages, but we'll update someday.
Yeah. No, that's cool.
So we'll try this again to load.
Cool. Yeah. So we were talking about crashes before we started the stream, and I've never had anything like that happen where it just like goes dead. So that's interesting.
Yeah, no, that's kind of the fun thing. Like I was saying, Octane would rarely crash on me while I was using it, unless I did something dumb like plugging the wrong type of node into the wrong other node,
Mm.
which is just expected. It's like, if you did something wrong, you upset the computer, yeah, okay, it's going to crash. But Redshift crashes on me more often while I'm working, but it
Yeah.
never crashes on me when I go to submit a render.
Huh.
So I've sort of accepted that trade-off.
Yeah.
At least I can render stuff the way that I would like to and not have to worry about like buying new video cards,
Right.
especially in this market now. Like, you know, that's kind of off the table to replace my three video cards.
Mm.
Um, so it looks like we're in.
Yeah.
This seems to be happy. So we'll lock the render view and then we'll jump out and I'll just kind of show off. So I know David Ariev was actually just talking on the DFW C4D sort of thing of trying not to light with HDRs.
Yeah.
And I kind of like that. When I was putting this shot together, that talk was still kind of fresh in my head a couple days ago,
Mm-hmm.
and I wanted to just try to take a stab at lighting this with only area and spotlights. Um, and I usually don't use this many colors, so we've got one, two. I think we've got 5 lights on right now, and I almost always kind of keep the color mode set to temperature just
Yeah.
because like the black body emission thing was familiar coming from Octane. That temperature slider from like warm on the low end up to cool color on the high end.
Mm.
And I just sort of just would always use that in Redshift. And this one I sort of jumped out of that and I started using like just really extreme colors, some really bright blues and reds and purples and stuff. And I got this like really cool color palette. And this is the raw, like right from Redshift. And if you compare this to the final result, it's pretty close.
Yeah.
Um, that is one thing I like to do personally as an artist. Um, I don't have access to like Nuke. I know Fusion as a compositing program is not too expensive, and I ought to jump into it, but I like to just nail everything in render. Messing with linear workflow was so tedious in Maya as a student learning it. It just really
Mm.
kind of turned me off of like having to worry about color management and gamma and all that other junk.
Yeah.
So, um, if I can do something in render, I do it. So for this one, the depth of field is baked into the render. There's no motion blur because it's just a still. Um, but I just do a little bit of Photoshop work. I'm big on the camera raw filter.
Yep.
And I can probably go into that a little bit. After we're done with cinema, I'll jump into the Photoshop process just to kind of wrap this up.
Cool. Nice.
Um, but yeah, this is pretty simple. I'll jump into the most interesting um, parts to show, which are probably the tire rubber and the faceplate for this wheel cover. I had seen some comments or some people saying like, "Hey, I like the tire rubber," so let's jump into that.
Yeah. It's definitely got a realistic vibe to it, and um, you could almost even talk about that too. Like, how do you feel coming from Octane and working with cars in here, where everybody is all about Octane being so photorealistic, but you've got a pretty damn photorealistic render here. So, do you feel like that's just come with experience of working with Redshift, or do you find that it's kind of just this stigma of bias versus unbiased?
That's a good question, and I'm not even sure I can answer it
Okay.
on why I like Redshift. I like Redshift because it's what I'm using right now,
Mm-hmm.
and it's cleaner in terms of noise than anything I was able to achieve in Redshift. But I I've been rendering cars a lot longer than I've been using cinema even. If I dig really deep back into Dropbox, just super quick, I can find my first ever car render. And I think the date on it was late 2013.
Wow. Okay.
So
Yeah.
that will sort of date like how long I've been trying this.
Mm.
Um, it is in the public. That's right. I remember when Dropbox used to have a public folder. That's how long I've been rendering cars.
Damn.
Okay.
I don't even think I remember Dropbox having a public folder.
Yeah, it's been a while. So, okay, I found it. Okay, so there's a couple extra pictures of my cat. because this is pretty old. But this is this is the first car that I ever rendered,
Mm-hmm.
and the date on it. Oh, hey, we upset Redshift. Am I still here?
Yeah, you're still there.
Okay. Whew, okay. Yeah, so this is December of 2013. So I apologize that I can't open this full screen,
Oh, that's all right.
but
Yeah, you've got a
this
good
little
preview
preview.
going.
Yeah. So even in here, I was already starting to get used to trying to get it right in render and not trying to do too much post, puzzle mats or material IDs or whatever.
Mm,
Um, and so I've always just kind of kept that mindset. Like I learned the proper way to do a beauty rebuild in Nuke with, multi-layer EXRs, and I couldn't do that stuff anymore because it's been too long since I've done it. But I knew its advantages and its kind of disadvantages in terms of the time investment and obviously the money investment. I don't really know when Fusion came out. Um, if it was even around when I started learning stuff. It
mm,
probably was, but I just never heard about it. And Nuke was impossibly expensive, and I just said, heck with it. So um, I've been like I said, to loop back around, I've been rendering stuff for forever. Um, I taught myself Redshift kind of within the span of a week. If you scroll back far enough on my Vimeo, it was this teal colored Porsche 993. I did that in June, and I put that together in probably 4 or 5 days, just familiarizing myself with the nodes and stuff. And I've been using nodes um, since I started learning Mental Ray and Maya. The
mm.
Hypershade is all nodes, so I've been basically using nodes since I started learning how to render.
Cool.
They've been familiar with me, and actually the hardest part of learning cinema was not having nodes. Um, like when I, years ago when I would use standard and physical render. So as soon as I got into the after or the third party render engine stuff in Octane, now in Redshift, I'm super, super comfortable. I know not everyone loves nodes or has learned nodes, but if you're out there on the fence thinking oh, it might be tricky to learn or whatever, it's really one of those things that's ubiquitous.
Yeah.
And even in just in 3D in general, I would learn one render engine, um, and in Maya, the ramp node might have a different name, but it functions like a ramp node. And as long as you learn the proper way or the proper times to use the ramp node, they can rename it the gradient node, and you're going to know what to do with it pretty
Right.
much. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Chad's talked about that too, about how going from Arnold into Octane and trying to make tutorials on that, where he would forget that the ramp is called gradient in Octane, and as long as you excuse me, as long as you can get past that, it is pretty similar through every 3D program and render application, no matter what you're using.
oh yeah, totally. And so many of the important parts of learning a node-based engine or even just approaching realism kind of to get back into this tire is breaking down photographic reference. There's never a time that I make something and I just came up with it 100% scratch in my head. I'm
Mm-hmm.
always recreating some aspect of a photo, whether I'm recreating the model of this wheel, which if I jump into the folder that this is from, we can see, I have a little reference folder here, and these thumbnails, you know, at some point I loaded these in and I was checking certain aspects of them. I probably had 10 other tabs open in Chrome with other references of what this wheel looked like, certain properties of oh, how is this thing spaced? What is the profile of how the thing curves? How big are the bevels? Yada yada. Where does the grime accumulate?
Yeah.
What portions of this are scratched? So on and so forth. And that training your eye for recognizing reference and seeing what's important when looking at an image because I didn't recreate this wheel entirely one to one. There are some extra holes in here. There's the cutout for the valve stem. I just kind of glossed over those details, but the stuff that I did pay attention to when looking at my reference was like what portions of this plate got dirty, what parts got scratched. I've rendered 100 tires, so I kind of already have a basic shader set up for the tire, which is really just kind of adapted from other scene files, and
Mm.
um, it's pretty standard. So if we go into it now, sort of for the first time, I have a base color here, sort of at the top, which is a darkish color. It's not purely black, because tires, or at least tire rubber, isn't purely black, nor is it purely reflective. So when we're getting into um, the material setting out here, we sort of have a separate, we basically have two branches of nodes. We have this branch, which correlates to the diffuse color.
Mm.
So if we zoom in, um, we can see that there are, hopefully on the screen share that this comes through, there are some patches that have like white speckles or sort of uh, portions of dirt and stuff. Tires are very unique in that um, they're almost every component of a shader built into one. They've got a diffuse component, they have a reflective component, and they, depending on like how into it you want to get, they can have either a little bit of subsurface scattering or a little bit of luminance,
Mm.
just to sort of emulate the way that light interacts with the surface. The important part of that is like in these crevices of the tire. Um, you don't want these to fall into like pure darkness, because rubber has a relatively high albedo. That's like the scientific term for how much light the diffuse portion of this shader reflects.
Mm.
Like if you think of the moon is a relatively bright thing, but it's not reflective, and that's like the albedo component
Cool.
of the diffuse material. So having like a little bit of that knowledge of like kind of real sciencey stuff, whatever, the benefit of learning that stuff at a school from somebody super smart, I realize I'm fortunate to sort of have that background. Um, so that sort of makes up the diffuse component. There are a handful of just, image shaders, which are random noise and like color stuff that I've accumulated and saved from online. That all makes up the diffuse. And then we have the portion that correlates to the reflection, roughness. Tires are somewhat reflective, kind of in the range of about, maybe 20 to 30%
Mm.
uh, of the reflectivity weight, but they're very rough. So even though these sliders have a little bit of value sort of baked in, they're being driven by maps or ramps that have actually a very, very different um, sort of resulting number.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of resources on how to build a good tire material if you're willing to look at tutorials from other render engines. Um, for rendering like cars, which is something that I'm into, a lot of stuff that I reference is V-Ray or 3ds Max users. Um, and that's another thing to tie back to when I was saying almost all of these engines are capable of the same sort of thing, and you
Mm.
shouldn't be afraid to learn one engine or apply information from one engine into a different engine. If I'm looking at a 3ds Max V-Ray tutorial and the guy is talking about what sort of Fresnel values he's using on his reflection, like I can just plug in those same, or at least start with the same number that he's plugging
Mm.
in Redshift and Cinema here, and I can see like, is this looking the way that his is looking? Oh, maybe the math's like a little off and the numbers don't correlate exactly to each other, because that sometimes happens, like
Right.
a value might go from 1 to 10 in one engine, but in another engine it only goes from 0 to 1 or
Right.
whatever. So you kind of just eyeball it until it kind of looks right if the numbers don't match up the same. And that's like a really, really valuable thing that I think, I feel like only Cinema 4D users don't expose themselves enough to is like looking at material or resources from other engines,
Mm,
just because like they're afraid that maybe something doesn't translate or whatever. Now, obviously, I'm not talking about like how to animate something or like how to use the graph editor or the timeline or whatever. Um, Rendering is way more cross-platform of information than like how do I bevel something or
right.
whatever, you know? Um,
Yeah.
so that
Yeah.
kind of walks through the tire. It's pretty simple, all things considered. My favorite part of sort of putting this render together was um, the other the other big portion of this, which was the cover plate here. So if I go original size so that we can sort of zoom in a little bit, we can hopefully just do a region render on portion of this, and we'll get into this node graph looks a little bit more sort of dramatic um, than the last one,
You're gonna scare him
and
away
that's
now, Billy.
and that's simply because when you're replicating a real life material, you want to think of how it is really built. And what I mean by that is this is like a piece of plastic or acrylic of some sort, and it has like probably a layer of paint over it.
Mm,
Um, so it's probably, it's hard to tell some layer of plastic with a white paint over it, and maybe even the red layers are maybe another layer of paint. Maybe they were like stenciled on, or whatever. And you want to use nodes with that same sort of logical process of building up a material. Okay, if we go down to the bottom of this stack, we are greeted with a color layer. And this base color is the red from the lettering, and then the cream. And then I just have a texture, which is basically this sort of pattern with the logo brands I just quickly made in Photoshop. Um, and this is sort of our ground level. If I were to remove all of this other junk up top, remove all the scratches and the grime, we would be left with a perfectly clear like cream and red image. um, so then the next thing we get to is just sort of surface level dirt, which is sort of a brown that is being mixed in with again another sort of image map. I use stuff from I forget who posted it, but it's called the Surfaces Collection on Gumroad. It's a really awesome pack that has like a bunch of grime and scratches and just all sorts of awesome stuff. I use that texture pack constantly, or I shouldn't say texture pack because it's just like a bunch of JPEGs and TIFFs.
gotcha.
Um, that all sort
Um,
of builds, and then all of these different other layers are just the different scratches, the different like speckles. uh, you just kind of build stuff up one level at a time, using all these different image maps. And yeah.
cool. Um, so you got a question from Chris in the chat. I don't know if you saw that pop up, but Chris was saying that he was hoping you could talk a little bit about your best practices with your render settings too as you're working on these things.
Yeah, so that's another thing that I really like about Redshift, as opposed to my time in Octane, um, was because I learned V-Ray years ago as my first render engine. The concept of unified samples or unified sampling is my language. It's how I think of how rendering works because it's the first thing that I was really taught. So if we go into our render settings and we jump into the Redshift tab, and this is why every time I send you a file, you always open it up and immediately say, "Whoa, those samples are way too high."
Yeah.
This happens every time I send you a file, and this is because I rely solely on unified sampling. Now, what unified sampling is, just in a nutshell, for anyone who might not know, is it is the sum total of all of the different types of samples. Um, in Octane, you have the one what's it called? It's the sample button, which goes from 0 all the way up to 8,000 or whatever.
The
Um,
sample button.
in Octane, like the global sample control slider. I forget
Oh
the name
yeah,
of
when
it.
you're like in direct lighting or no.
In in whatever mode,
Yeah,
it's your maximum amount of samples. So
yeah,
we've got our max amount of samples. For this image, I stuck with like 1,024. I will usually start at 4,096, 4K samples, and then work my way down. Uh, and I That's basically the other way around than for most people how they work. Most people start low and then go high depending on how much noise. I basically start high, and if it's too slow or too long, then I'll lower it.
hmm.
Um, I just love having as clean of a render as I possibly can.
Mm.
And if I have the time to sit around for 8 minutes a frame, then I'll do that. If I don't have the time to sit around for 8 minutes a frame and I need to get it down to like 2 minutes a frame or 30 seconds a frame or whatever, then I'll actually start lowering my samples. Um, but to get back to Unified, basically all of my different sample settings for reflection, refraction, etc., they're all set at like 4,000, which is about the highest I'll ever go. And then you really don't need to worry about those. I know you teach sampling a little bit differently in one of your Redshift um, tutorials, and that is doing samples through the materials and through the lights
Yeah,
themselves. Um, that is all really, really good stuff to learn, and it's probably the proper way to learn how to get the absolutely fastest render you can. But because I'm a little lazy and sometimes I like to just sit around and watch YouTube while something's rendering, um, I don't mind if my render takes a little bit longer if I don't have to fiddle with it as much. Um,
yeah. I
so
like you have this. You were saying like you like to start really wide, and if you have the time to do it, then it's fine. And I kind of do the inverse, like you were saying, where like I play this game with myself. Like, how fast can I get this to render? Like, I want to see
mhm.
if I can get it down to like 3 seconds.
Yeah. I mean, and I sort of like gawk at the idea of a 3 second render, like not in a bad way. It's just like
Yeah.
I haven't, well, I should say, I'm fortunate enough to not have to be that crunched.
Mm.
Um, and so I guess I'm a little spoiled. Um, I really haven't done a whole lot in the other sort of settings. I initially got this render setting preset from an awesome artist, Patrick Latorno, in the motion design artist Slack. If we want, I can get you a Dropbox link to this, and we can include it in like the description or whatever if we
Sure.
upload this afterwards.
Yeah.
It's a pretty good starting point. It's not perfect. Some of the settings for the AOVs, which we'll get into in my next example, some of them are a little funky. The amount of passes that he has set up by default are for his workflow, and I don't really change them often enough to save myself my own preset.
Mm.
So those are kind of, they are what they are. I change them whenever I need to change them. Um, and then GI, I just do brute force primary, irradiance cache secondary, which is probably the most common use case for Redshift, I would think. Um, this is pretty similar in terms of look to using what's the second kernel in Octane called?
There's direct
There's
lighting and path tracing.
right, it's and then there's QMC, but no one ever uses QMC.
Yeah.
Right. So I think this is similar to the second of those options from Octane in terms of like how the GI sort of looks, how much bounce lighting you're getting. I saw one person asking about how to increase the contribution
Mm.
of GI. So for, I forget your name, whoever asked, if you want to, I believe in the light settings, what you can do is you can up your, where is it?
I think it's in Photon.
Yeah, in Photon. If you wanted to um, break physics and include more GI contribution than what the render engine wants to give you, you would want to enable emit GI photons, and then you would turn this intensity on each of your lights above 1. 1 is
Mm-hmm.
kind of the baseline of where they would be at, and uh, then you would want to enable photons here in the caustic, or you would want to enable caustics here in the photon tab of Redshift, and then just to make sure that you've got one extra level of control, I would probably recommend turning on the AOVs, and then you would want to give yourself, I'll just change one of these. You would want to give yourself the caustic raw pass for the AOVs. And then that way you'll always be able to dial up or down a little bit further. Um, so that'll answer whoever asked that.
Yeah, I forget who asked too, and kind of the inverse, or a little bit to relate to Octane, like you were saying, like the Octane's GI clamp. If you're ever working and you feel like you want some GI, but you can get a little bit faster speed, this is one way to do. Like still have GI and clamp it back a little bit too.
Yeah. So I think I'll jump into my other example that I wanted to show, which was a different car.
Cool. I'm just gonna say hi to a couple people that have said hi.
Yeah.
I've been ignoring the chat. Let's see. We've got Mark. We effing love you too, dude. I hope you're enjoying your new job. Let's see who else. Let's get back. Chris, thanks for your question, man. I hope Billy was able to answer that, and thanks. I definitely want to try and do some more guests too, like maybe once a month, because I'm enjoying this. This is nice to kind of just learn other people's workflows. Nick, what's up, man? Can't wait to see you at NAB. I'm glad you're joining us. And okay. Somebody also said that it's PMC, not QMC or QVC or whatever we called it. And I think that's it.
Oh, that's a good question from Chris. Any way to convince me to start a scene from scratch, assuming I'm at the geometry phase, but doing like look dev. I am building another scene kind of in my spare time right now, and if we want to, again next week, or maybe I can talk with the Brograph guys and do like my own dedicated time, or maybe I'll just do my own on Twitch.
Mm.
A couple days from now, I'm gonna have a new cool scene to do that. So, Chris, if you want to find me on social media, I'm sure Liam has done his due diligence and linked some of my stuff on Twitter or whatever.
Yep.
I was tagged. You can follow me or hit me up and get more info on when I'll be doing that.
Yeah, and
So
yeah, we can definitely talk to the Brograph guys, because I mean, you could take over one of my Thursdays with ease. It's really easy to get set up. So, also, hi Julie. I see that you're joining in. Thanks for joining.
Oh, hey Julie, how's it going?
Okay, so wait, what was Chris just asked a question that you just answered? So breaking it down from scratch. So yeah, Chris, we'll look into that, and maybe next week or the week following we can have Billy jump in and start one from scratch. That'd be a cool idea.
Yeah. So, okay, this is the other cool thing that I worked on over the last weekend, and we crashed. So, good old Redshift.
Well, while you're rebooting, somebody's asking about links.
Yeah.
I can't post links into chat, but I can at least show you Billy's site. So if it's GER, N as in Nancy, GE.com. So Gurnge, right?
Yep,
Yeah.
that's me. It's a made up name.
Well, this is Billy's site here, and maybe in a little bit. Actually, you know what? While you're rebooting, I'm gonna play your reel one more time, because we had the sound off at the beginning, and I don't think it actually came through. So,
No, it's not super important. Who listens to reels with music?
yeah, I guess. But you guys should totally check out Billy's reel too if you missed it in the beginning. So I'll go back into this window now. Looks like you're back up going. Make sure I go full screen. Cool. Usual spots, GSG, iDesign. Yeah.
So maybe just to spare Redshift crashing again, we will demonstrate how this works. So I rendered a car, and I rendered it separately from the background. and I don't know if you've covered how to do a backplate in any of your Redshift stuff, but I know you've covered DOM images or HDRs, as most
Mm.
people will just know the name as. Um, so I got a really awesome set that includes a backplate and a handful of images, and actually I can show those to spare Redshift potentially crashing again, because I do want to go over Photoshop real quick. So the HDR is this, what most people will know or they'll be familiar calling an HDRI.
Mm.
Uh, Technically, that's a misnomer. This is called a lat long image, latitude by longitude. It's 2 times wider than it is tall, and that allows us to wrap an image around it. HDR refers to the like bit depth, how much lighting information is in this file. But this was taken, and then these sets of images that you load in separately uh, acts as the background for your image, so that the HDR is providing the lighting and the shadows and stuff. It is what your objects are reflecting. In this case, like car paint and wheels and windows and all that fun stuff. And then we use the backplate setting to basically put this in the background and line the camera up. Similarly, I would rather do that in a recording so that way I don't have to worry about crashes. Unfortunately, my system is being a little testy. So we will get Photoshop going, and I'll show how to basically export what you need to be able to uh, do this sort of process. Um, because I'm not a super pro at AOVs and all that cool stuff, I did it as 2 separate renders. If you were super awesome, you could do it just as one and output like the shadow pass and whatever other alpha, all that other cool stuff, all in one go. But because it was just a still image, I didn't really have too much fuss kind of outputting one at a time.
Mm.
So if we isolate this layer, this is directly what comes out of Redshift. Um, the backplate set that I had some versions that had motion blur in them, which was pretty cool. So I set up motion blur on the wheels, so the wheels look like they're spinning, they're doing their fun thing. There's a little bit of depth of field, just because I matched the aperture setting on the camera that the real photograph was taken of, which is an important part of matching a 3D asset into a real photograph. It's trying to replicate those camera settings as closely as you can. Again, because we're working in 3D, you can like break physics a little bit. You don't have to match your aperture or the ISO like directly 1 to 1, but getting close helps. Um,
Now, did you get
so
that through like metadata? Is that how you found that, or you just?
the pack actually has the camera settings for every photo that's in it.
Oh,
So
cool,
there's a photo, and then there's like a little text document that says the f-stop, the ISO, the shutter speed, all that fun jazz.
cool.
So that was pretty cool. This came from an artist named Owner Durson. I'll just write that in chat real quick because it's a hard name to spell.
Yeah, well, that's really cool that they provide that for you. Somebody who, let's see, I think this is Vitus. Let's see, Vitus. Yeah, maybe it is R16 that's doing it. I don't know. We were
Yeah,
talking.
that could totally be
Yeah,
part of my problem. One day I'll update
and
when I get
then
paid.
let's see, Chris Crocker wants to know: have you ever played with Eevee for Blender? I know that's just coming out. I don't use Blender at all, so I haven't played with it.
Right, so we've got our raw render, and then we have a car only render. And I just did this because I forgot how to set up a puzzle map, and I didn't feel like looking up a tutorial, so I just rendered the car on alpha because it took 4 minutes to render the scene, and it probably would have taken me longer than 4 minutes to look up a tutorial,
Mm-hmm.
scrub through the tutorial, find the right part of information, and then enable it. So I don't know. I just said hell with it. So I rendered the car on its own so that I would have a clean alpha. Um, and then, so let's basically just build this back up. I have one render that has a little bit of an exposure adjustment that I masked with some masking. And then the raw backplate, which was the image, the original image itself that I just wanted to layer back over because Redshift does this weird thing. Whereas if you have depth of field in your camera, it will apply depth of field to the backplate. And I don't know if that's a bug or if that's a feature, but Octane doesn't do it.
I noticed that too for something I was rendering the other day. That
Mm-hmm.
not only does it apply motion blur to the backplate, but it won't rotate it with your camera too. So if you turn 90 degrees, it doesn't actually pan the background either.
Right, yeah. So I know this is Redshift Thursday and we all love Redshift, but I'm not claiming it's perfect.
Oh, I should talk Redshift all the time on Redshift Thursday. It's okay. You can talk
Oh yeah,
about it,
yeah. We,
especially
we
with
talk. I'll talk mad shit.
yeah.
So, all right, turn that mask back on. Turn these other cars back on. I also did a little bit of work with the caustics, and what caustics are is the reflection of light from the reflective component of the material. So these like chrome wheels and the metallic car paint, a property of those things in real life is a caustic reflection, which is, kind of light rays sort of bouncing off. It's a pretty subtle effect because I was pretty conservative with it. I've kind of painted out the mask pretty heavily, but if you sort of look at the wheels, just below the wheels on the ground, you'll see it kind of brights it up a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So that all basically just comes together to the combined, what I would just call the combined base. And then I just color corrected a little bit. I didn't do a whole lot on this render. I used some of the LUTs from the Grayscale Gorilla LUT pack, which, if you're not familiar with what a LUT is, it is a lookup table.
Mm-hmm.
It is something that video editing people more commonly use to match the color temperature of one camera to another camera. At least that's my experience or familiarity with it. Maybe that's not a perfect definition of what it is or a history
Yeah,
lesson on it, but
I,
it's
I
pretty
think that's
close.
a pretty I think that's a pretty accurate background. Excuse me. The way I understand it now is that most people like it look up table. They're just like looking up different color schemes now to apply it.
Hmm.
But really, it originates from matching cameras.
Yeah. So the other big thing that I do when I sort of uh, color correct or render, I shouldn't say color correct, it's more just like color grading.
Mm.
Because I like to just sort of get wild with color sometimes, or I don't necessarily approach or go after like a photorealistic color grading or like what a real color artist would. I like to just push stuff a little bit further, a little bit more saturated, a little bit more vibrant um, sometimes. So I use the Camera Raw filter and a plugin from Google called the Google Nick Collection. I'll just
Mm-hmm.
write this down. Google Nick Collection. If you were to Google Nick Collection, you'll find that it is a free plugin for Photoshop, which is pretty spiffy. Um, but if I go back to the raw render of this, we'll see this is the raw render, and this is, oops, no, this is the raw render, and this is where we leave off. So I'm not doing a ton of color adjustment to it. It's a lot of this color is present here in the original render. Um, I did one pass with one of the GSG LUTs just to sort of achieve a specific sort of look for what this white plastic looked like. And then I started going hog wild with my normal uh, suspects, which is the camera raw filter. If you're not familiar with the camera raw filter, it's kind of like Lightroom, having all of these different color temperature, exposure, levels. It's got chromatic aberration, vignetting. haze, like all sorts of stuff, all wrapped into one neat little package. Now, this isn't anything that After Effects couldn't do, or even just individual filters in Photoshop. But because it's all contained in one little place, um, and here's the super cool part, is you can save these as presets. And I did a series of dailies a couple years ago. So a lot of these are dated from 2015.
Mm-hmm.
And so when anytime I'll open up a render that I've just freshly, kicked out of the render queue or the picture viewer, the first thing I do is jump into the camera raw filter and I just start scrolling through this list of presets that I've made for myself. It would be like if you used what's that? Magic Bullet Looks, or
Gotcha.
like Magic Bullet Colorista or whatever. It's got all those presets that it comes with by default. I've got all of these awesome, tons of variety. If I just click randomly through these, because this is already sort of colored, it's a little bit harder to tell what each different filter is kind of doing. But some of these are pretty extreme, others are more subdued. Um, and I basically just kind of pick one of these or use it as a starting off point, get happy with it, and then I jump into um, the Google Nick plugin. And from the list of plugins that it installs, the one that I use is called Analog FX. Um, and this one is a little annoying because every layer that you add over here on the right has a loading bar,
Mm.
which is kind of a drag when it comes time to export this because it has to load through every one of these loading bars every frame. Um, so when I need to export something from Photoshop, I'll probably just go watch an episode of something on TV, because Photoshop basically, because of the way that it works, it takes focus from your computer. It basically will jump to the foreground of no matter what
Mm.
program you're using. Photoshop will pop back to the front, and it'll interrupt everything you're doing every frame. So I like to congratulate myself on finishing a render by going to watch something on TV. So uh, pretty much the same thing. I've got a list of presets that I've made up, kind of built up over time, that I can click through. And this is like probably my favorite part of 3D, is doing fun color stuff. If we, oops, go to the camera setting, we can go, where's that? I forget how to get the other. Here we go. Here's the list of all the other different effects that you can add. You can add like blurs and exposures. You can even do um, little bits of like dirt on the camera lens, all
Cool.
sorts of awesome stuff in this. It's really like probably 10 different effects that I would roll into one, like chromatic aberration, like tilt shift blurring, radial or like fake motion blurring, not motion vectors, but like doing like speed blur kind of,
Yeah.
like action stuff. It can do like light leaks. Um, yeah, it can do a lot. And it's free. Check it out. It's pretty cool. And those two things, Camera Raw and Google Nick, basically is that's my process.
Cool. Yeah, I've heard of Google Nick. I've just never used it. And now that I see it, I want to use it.
Yeah. It is a drag on seriously how slow it is. Um, so be prepared. Like if you try to render out like a 500 or 1,000 frame sequence, um, and again, like because Photoshop has a timeline, that's totally a thing that you can do. And I totally do color correction on animations in Photoshop. I don't use After Effects um, much to do color work. Um, it does take a while. I have definitely kicked some stuff out to like an hour or 2 hour long exports just to get a frame sequence back.
Wow.
Um, yeah, so if they could make it quicker, it would be perfect, literally perfect.
Yeah, Chris Crocker was saying in chat that I guess they're not updating it anymore, which that sucks.
That sounds about right. I'm
Oh,
like an Android user, so I'm familiar with Google's endeavors into messaging platforms, um, even like Chrome extensions. Google loves to just come out with stuff and then kill it a year or two later.
yeah.
Um, yeah, so they're gonna have to pry this out of my cold dead hands.
um, I wonder if you could save some of these looks as like a lookup table and then apply it in After Effects or Premiere or somewhere, if that would speed up your workflow at all.
That's a good question. I know the Camera Raw presets, they are saved somewhere on my machine. I've
Mm-hmm.
never looked into where exactly, but in After Effects, if you import a footage, there is like the interpret main button or whatever,
Yeah.
where like when you would usually change the frame rate.
Mm.
Somewhere in there in the color management settings, if you have it set to 32-bit, there is a Camera Raw.
Huh.
Now, applying my library of presets from Photoshop into After Effects is what I've never looked into.
Yeah.
Um, so that would be pretty cool. But yeah, if Google Nick was available for After Effects, I would probably use After Effects because when I'm done in Photoshop, the only thing I'd use After Effects for is adding optical flares.
Right.
Um, yeah, so it'd be cool to save one step if this worked in AE,
Hmm.
but it doesn't.
I'm definitely gonna have to look into it because even if it's discontinued, it's still working. So
Oh yeah, and
yeah.
if for some reason you can't download it, I'm sure deep down buried in my downloads folder, I have the initial installer. And maybe that's considered piracy, but if they've taken it down, then to hell with them, I say. It's such a good thing that if they made it not available anymore, I would be super bummed out. So,
Huh. Oh look, so somebody did. So Chris is writing. There is a workaround to use the Nick collection in Photoshop through After Effects.
now that sounds like some black magic shit. I would love to learn how to figure that out. I love like breaking computers or like doing hacky workarounds. Um, so definitely hit me up or I'll look into it. And if I can't figure it out, maybe I'll internet stalk you and hit you up
Yeah.
on how to do that. Thank you,
Um,
Chris.
yeah, Chris, are you the Chris Crocker that runs Post Chat? If I want, I might know who this Chris is. It's like MoChat, but posts for like editors and post production.
Oh, that's sweet.
Yeah.
All the stuff that I pretend to know about.
Yeah, me too. Um, yeah, so I guess is there anything else that you want to show in your workflow? And if not, I was gonna say, why don't you bring up like your Instagram and Twitter, and you can plug that and show people where you're located. And
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So if I open up my new tab, I've got my Instagram, which is pretty much if you type in my fake internet name, Gernge, Grnge, you'll find me on pretty much any social media platform that is commonly used. Not Vero, though. I am not on the Vero bandwagon. Um,
yeah, I'm already off of it.
I think most people are off of it.
It took
So
so long. It was
I'm
so
glad that I
slow.
never got on it.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I'm underscore Gernge on Twitter, unfortunately. Um, I've got a Twitch, which I use once in a while. Maybe I'll do some stuff over the weekend. I know we had a request to show some cool stuff start to finish, so maybe I'll do something Sunday, I'll say preliminarily. Yeah, so we got Instagram, Twitter. I have a Tumblr if you use Tumblr. I don't ever. And then I've got my website. So come check me out.
Sweet.
Thanks for having me, Liam.
Oh yeah, of course, man. Like you're talking in Slack the other day, and I was like, man, I should just have you on. So it worked out really well. I guess also, man, I just had a thought in my mind and I completely lost it.
oh yeah, and Slack. I'm in virtually every relevant Slack to motion design. So hit me up in any of those as well. I love to post emoji reacts.
Yeah, emoji reacts and Giphy reacts and
Hmm.
lots of things. Um, yeah, so that I guess that's pretty much it. I guess does anyone have any questions last minute for Billy? Um, I'm gonna I'm gonna do a quick run through of just my tutorial from the week. I might not actually because we've talked for so long now. I feel like I don't even need to do a tutorial. People can just wait till next week.
Yeah, save your
um,
content.
yeah. But yeah, before we close out, does anyone have any questions for Billy or last minute thoughts? I'm going to run through the chat really quick, make sure I didn't miss anything.
Yeah, I pretty much just focused on talking, and I love to talk. So apologies for neglecting chat.
Oh, yeah, no, I had a feeling that I was going to neglect chat tonight a bit. Oh, Blair, you said bye. Sorry, Blair. I hope you had fun. Let's see. Sage joined in. Why did I miss that?
Oh man, I missed. Dang.
Ah, man, cool runnings. Let's see. Blair. I think we've got most of them. Bias base, we answered. Chris.
So one last thing to loop all the way back to the beginning of when I was talking about networking. I'll be going to NAB. I know as will you, Liam.
Oh,
So
yeah.
anyone listening, if you don't have a local MoGraph scene, come to NAB. That's the scene.
Yep.
So can't recommend in real life meetups enough. We've got a pretty awesome setup going in Michigan. I know there are ones in Dallas, New York, yada yada. Um, if you don't have something like that around where you live, then get off your butt, make it happen, get out to these big ones, because everyone's there, and that's what the cool kids are doing.
Yeah. To piggyback off that, I don't really have anything where I am in like the Baltimore area, and I started traveling last year and meeting people. We kind of talked about this in the beginning too. At these meeting people at these locations changes the MoGraph industry for you a lot. Um, so I reiterate that a lot. Plus, there's going to be a giant meetup on the first Sunday of the event through School of Motion and Christo and Brograph and Grayscale Gorilla. So there's that whole event. What else is there? The Motion Media Ball, and doesn't Maxon have its own event too? One of the
Yeah,
nights.
yeah. So
Yeah.
the Gam So Dobro meetup is Sunday night at NAB. The Media Motion Ball is Monday night. Tuesday night is the Max on Pinball Party. And then Wednesday night is the Mokart Go Kart Premier Racing League for motion designers.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely, if you make it out to NAB, be a part of any or all of those things that I just said. I'll be there. I know Liam, you'll be at some of those. Um, Tons of people come out to this thing, so put it on your list. It's about a month away, so you've got time to book that flight, figure out the Airbnb situation. Don't let the world get past you. I
Yeah.
say.
And let's see. Nick just joined in chat. Nick Scarcella saying
Oh,
your
is
work
he
is
an
dope.
SCR, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
He's got
Dude, you're
the
dope. Hell yeah.
yeah. He's saying your work's dope. Nick, please put out another HDR pack because they're awesome.
Oh yeah, man.
Yeah.
Like half of the last set of things I've rendered have been with the Manhattan Knights. So,
Yeah, if you guys don't know, Nick puts out Manhattan Nights. They're HDR packs from Manhattan, and they have beautiful glows about them and just look great. So yeah, I guess that's it for about tonight. I know it's a little bit different format, but I want to do this at least once a month. I think so. If you are a participant in our chats every Thursday, um, and you want to be on, I know the Redshift community is a lot smaller than say Octane and Arnold and all that. So hit me up with your reel and information, and maybe going forward every few weeks I can get some of you guys on here and talking about work. I think that'd be really fun. But Billy, thanks so much for joining me. I know it was kind of last minute. Yesterday we are just like, let's do this, but I think it worked out really well, and I appreciate your time.
Yeah, it's been a blast. It was lucky timing this week.
Yeah.
So
Cool. All right, guys. Well, thank you all for watching. If you want to join in every Thursday, we do Redshift Live. Brograph has their Slack channel, which we're really active in, and Billy was saying well, there's other Slack channels that we're really active in as well. But if you want to join Brograph, which this is streaming on, that's brograph.com/Slack. You can find me 531. Just do a search for FIVE31. Pretty much like Billy. Sometimes I have an underscore, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I have a hyphen. Just kind of the way the internet works now. And that's about it. So thanks everybody who was in chat and joining. It seemed like we had a pretty good crowd tonight. I was watching the numbers go up for viewers, even though the chat wasn't as active. But I'm glad to see so many people turned out. All right, guys. Billy, thanks again. And everyone else, I will talk to you soon.
peace.